All right, so we're going to start. I want to say I miscounted the number of sessions. I thought that there were 6 units left to do in the faith unit. There are only 5. So we're only going to, we'll obviously meet today, and then we're going to meet the next 2 weeks. And I'll have Myra send out an email about this. You don't have to remember, but we will not be having the final class because we will be out of curriculum at that point. So I don't know how I miscounted it because they're all marked very nicely, but I did. So last week we spoke about, God acting in history. We talked about the biblical perspective, mostly by looking at the story of the Exodus from Egypt, which, and there are obviously other places in the Torah and in the Bible where God, kind of, gets into history and changes the course of history and acts on behalf of the Israelites, whether it's in a war, whether it's freeing them from slavery, whatever it may be. And by the time we get to Rabbinic Judaism, they are obviously very aware of the fact that the era of prophecy is over. So not only do they not have God overtly acting in history to change the course of events, but they also don't have a prophetic voice coming to tell the people that they've gotten, that the prophet's gotten direct communication from God with instruction of how the people are supposed to act. And so the rabbis, one could argue, though how they look at it may be different than the way we look at it, they really begin, I think, to articulate for all of us the questions of, where is God? What is a miracle? Will God act in history again? They don't phrase it like this, but why, was God acting all over in the Bible, and now we don't see it in that way? And so we're going to look at 3 Talmudic texts today that begin to try to look at these. Begin to look at this, theological challenge of, where is God? So let me just share the screen. Okay. So this first text is, all 3 texts are taken from the Talmud. And just to give a little background, so they're talking about the constellations or astrology. So just a little bit of sort of background information. Astrology for the rabbis was almost considered science, like what we would consider science today, right? That the stars move, that the stars influence our behavior, that if we're born under a certain sign, that it may have it could potentially have some influence on us and some influence on outcomes. And the thing that you probably don't know that's really fascinating is, what is the Talmudic Hebrew word for constellation? Anybody know? You're going to love this. Mazal. When we say mazal tov and we say good luck, it really comes from the idea that, like, that your fate could be connected to the stars, to the constellations, to where, when people read their horoscope every day, the rabbis would not have totally discounted that as something real. And so they kind of struggle with that, right? They kind of struggle with the idea that while human beings could be guided by constellations, you can imagine that they don't particularly love that, because what does that say about God? What does that say about fate? If we're only guided by by what's happening in the nighttime sky and everything is inevitable and it's all fate, then what does God, what does behavior, what do morals, what does, ethical moral behavior? And And so there's actually a phrase, Ein Mazal LiYisrael, which doesn't mean that, Israelites just don't have good luck. It means that, other people may be guided by the constellations, but Israelites should not. It takes away sort of the idea of free will. But again, I don't think anybody knows that when you're wishing somebody a mazal tov, you're not really, from a historical perspective, you're not really wishing them good luck. You're more like wishing them, when somebody is pregnant, we don't say to them mazel tov, we say bisha'a tova, like may you deliver at a good time. So it's sort of almost the same kind of blessing, like may you, may the stars align, right? May the stars align for you, might be a way that we would say it today. Because of course, luck is about the idea of this, is connected to the idea of the stars aligning. But it's an odd phrase for Jews, right? It's not, Baruch Hashem is probably a more religious way of looking at it, but it's a folk colloquial term that we use all the time. Okay, it was stated that Rabbi Hanina says a constellation makes one wise and a constellation makes one wealthy, and there's a constellation for the Jewish people that influences them, right? So one rabbi would basically say, like, there is such a thing as astrology, and depending if you're born at the right, what your sign is, you could be wise, you could be wealthy. If the stars align, you could have both of these things. And there's even a constellation just for the Jewish people. Rabbi Yochanan says there's no constellation for the Jewish people that influences them. The Jewish people are not subject to the influence of astrology, right? So you see this debate, which is really a debate, if we were to put it maybe in more modern terms, between fate and maybe charting your own path, right? Are we just, and the reality is probably both, right? I was going to say, are we just subject to fate, or do we, create our own fate? And probably, I don't know. What do you think? I would say we're probably both, but what do you think? Are we subject to fate, or are we subject to our own actions?
Subject to our own actions.
Okay. Anybody else have a different or same opinion?
I'm a strong believer in free will.
Right.
Yeah.
So is Judaism, right? So is Judaism. But then the question is, but there are things that happen that's not in our control, right? Things that just happen that, I got to study with Harold Kushner when I was in rabbinical school, and he really was a Reconstructionist, and his theology, when bad things happen to good people, and his theology was, as you probably know, was heavily influenced by having a sick child.
Yeah.
And trying to make sense of what that meant. And his child had, I don't remember the name of the disease, where you start aging very quickly and then you die very young, which has got to be one of the most horrific things you could watch your young child go through. And, in trying to sort of make sense out of that, for him, he really doesn't feel that God acts, that God is sort of, in a Kaplanian way, that, that God doesn't really act in the world and God doesn't act in our lives. But he told this story about when he was a congregational rabbi. There was a woman in his congregation who came to him a few days before she was supposed to attend some event at a nightclub. The last minute, she decided not to go. There was a terrible fire in the nightclub and many people died. And she said to Rabbi Kushner, like, thank God, like God saved me from keeping me from going. And he said, I didn't say this to her, but I thought in my mind, if God saved you, then I don't question his power, I question his taste. This, like, why you, right? These other people got you, like, it was a very nice thing to say. But this idea of, like, why do some people show up at a nightclub and some people stay home. So you could say, you know, it's God. So that's not a very satisfactory answer to the people that, you know, who lost family members because their family members went. Or you can say there is a certain amount of fate in the world. You know, there's a certain amount of fate in the world that's out of our control, that things happen that are out of our control. If we're fortunate because for some reason we decided not to attend someplace where something dangerous happens. So the rabbis of the Talmud are sort of grappling with two things can really be true at the same time, right? That there is fate in the world, but fate shouldn't also at the same time shouldn't just totally determine our destiny. So there's a Talmudic debate about this. And so Rabbi Hanina says that, no, that's the way the world works. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no, that's not the way the world works, or certainly not for the Jewish people. And Rabbi Yochanan follows his own reasoning. As Rabbi Yochanan said, from where is it derived that there is no consolation for the Jewish people? As it is stated, thus said the Lord, learn not the ways of the nations and be not dismayed at the signs of heaven, for the nations are dismayed at them. The nation will be dismayed by them, but not the Jewish people. So, we're going to look at a little bit more of this Talmud, but Rabbi Yochanan is, you know, all of this astrology stuff and this constellation stuff, that's for, you know, people that aren't Jewish, but for Jewish people, we don't, you know, we don't follow all of that. Ina?
What were the were the first two rabbis of the same time?
You know what? That's an excellent question, and I don't know. I'd have to look that up. Can I get back to you on that? I
just wondered if the second was denying the constellations, was more of a later in the times.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I'll have to look that up. I don't know. But whoever the editor or editors of the Talmud were, Rabbi Yochanan, at least in this debate, well, we'll see the next paragraph, but he gets the final say. So, and Rabbi Yochanan was a much more well-known rabbi. So it is possible that, you know, I mean, well, I shouldn't say that. Rabbi Hanina was pretty well-known in his own right. You know what? I'll look it up and I'll let you know if next week. But now we're going to have a story. And the story is about Rabbi Akiva's daughter. And Rabbi Akiva is a greater rabbi than Rabbi Hanina and than Rabbi Yochanan. And he lives before them. He's earlier. So let's see what Rabbi Akiva thinks about, you know, fate versus merit. Let's say merit, right? That your actions merit a certain response. And from that which transpired to Rabbi Akiva, the Talmud loves to do this. Okay, we have this debate, but now we have a story of something that, you know, let's just believe it happened. We have a story of something that happened to Rabbi Akiva's daughter. And from that which transpired to Rabbi Akiva as well, it can be derived that there is no constellation for the Jewish people, right? There's no astrological fate the Jewish people live under, as Rabbi Akiva had a daughter. And Chaldean astrologers told him that on the same day that she enters the wedding canopy, a snake will bite her and she will die. So that's a bad horoscope. Her horoscope for the day of her wedding was terrible. So non-Jewish astrologers say, oh my God, on her wedding day, she's going to be bit by a snake and die. So that's a pretty dire prediction. And she was very worried about this, as you could imagine. On that day, her wedding day, she took the ornamental pin from her hair and stuck it in a hole in the wall for safekeeping, right? So she's getting ready and she takes the pin out of her hair and she sticks it in the wall and continues, you know, where it'll be safe. She won't lay it down somewhere where she doesn't know where it is. And it happened that it entered directly into the eye of the snake. So that was that just fortuitous, right? Like there was the snake, she doesn't know the snake is there, sticks her pin there, I guess kills the snake by sticking the pin into the snake's eye. In the morning, when she took the pin, the snake was pulled and came out with it. Her father, Rabbi Akiva, said to her, "What did you do to merit being saved from the snake?" And she told him, "In the evening, a poor person came and knocked on the door, and everyone was preoccupied with the feast, and no one heard him. I stood and took the portion that you had given me and given it to him." Rabbi Akiva said to her, "You performed a mitzvah, and you were saved in its merit." Rabbi Akiva went out and taught based on this incident that even though it's written, "And charity will save from death," it does not mean that it will save a person only from an unusual death, but even death itself. So what side does Rabbi Akiva come down on? Is it faith or is it act deeds?
Fate.
Faith.
Deeds, right? She's at her wedding party, everybody's celebrating, the feast is going on, it's noisy, and a poor person knocks on the door and nobody hears because it's a party, and the bride herself goes to answer the door, and there's a beggar, and she gives her money, and therefore she's saved from the snake. So whatever the evil decree, we kind of say this on the high holidays, right? Like, prayer, charity, prayer, and deeds of loving kindness will avert the evil decree, right? That's Unatana Tokef, and we say that on Yom Kippur. So the idea that there's fate in the world, but if you act in good ways, you can avert your fate. Slight problem with this, or major problem with this. What's the major problem with this?
Bad things happen to good people.
Does it work? Like, it would be really nice, right? Wouldn't it be really nice if only good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people? And, the rabbis want to believe. Yeah, I've shared this many of times, and I don't even remember who the author is right now, but there's a short story about a young boy whose mother is dying. And he goes out and he gives money to all of these poor people, and his mother dies. And he says to his father, "But it says in the Talmud, charity will save you from death." And his father says, "Yeah, but not you. It saves the people that you give the money to." Right, which is a way of turning this piece of Talmud on its head, right? Charity saves from death, it doesn't save the giver. But Rabbi Akiva thinks it does. But this short story turns on the head and says it doesn't save the giver, it saves the recipient. Yes, Ina.
But then how do you explain that he was doing a mitzvah and the mitzvah turned against him?
Right. Look, they're one of the most
Where's
famous,
the explanation of that?
right? One of the most famous stories in the Talmud, to quote Rabbi Frankel, famous to a small group of people, is the story of one of the great apostates of Jewish tradition, Elisha ben Abuye. He is contemporary with like a student of Rabbi Akiva. So he's the next generation. He was a great rabbi. And the story says he was walking along the way and he sees a young boy's father say, "Go climb up that tree and to collect the eggs." And the boy climbs up the tree, sends away the mother bird, goes to collect the eggs, and falls out of the tree and dies. So there are, and he becomes a heretic after this. He leaves after seeing this, and part of the reason is there are two laws in the Torah that we're told that if you do these two laws, the days of your life will be long. One of them is honoring your mother and father, and the other one is sending away the mother bird before you collect the eggs. So he sees this boy engaged in both the mitzvah of honoring his father and the mitzvah of sending away the mother bird, and nonetheless, he falls out of the tree and dies. And so this is a crisis of faith for him, because there's no reward even though the Torah promises reward. So the rabbis really struggle with these concepts, like they're not Pollyannish about the reality of the world around them. Rabbi Akiva, the very rabbi that says that doing good deeds can save you from death because it saves his daughter, how does he die? He's martyred by the Romans. We read about it on Yom Kippur, right? He continues to teach Torah, even though Torah is forbidden to be taught by the Romans, and he's tortured to death. And we have the Talmud has a pretty graphic description of like him being tortured to death. And so this same rabbi that insists that his daughter is saved because she gives, tzedakah, I assume gave tzedakah and was a teacher of Torah and is martyred. So, they're really trying to grapple with what, some sort of a coherent theology. They don't want to indict God. They don't want to indict God. I think I would say that they're trying to save God's honor, and God's goodness and God's power. But, but at the same time, they are living through horrifically difficult times. So let's look at the next source. Okay. So again, this is a story about God acting in history and why doesn't God act in history? And so this is probably a more, well, this is definitely a more in-depth. Like if the first selection we looked at was perhaps somewhat superficial, and I would, and an anecdotal story about a snake getting a pin in its eye. This is a much more in-depth story about what happens when there's evil in the world, or what's God's relationship to evil in the world, and what's God's role in acting in the world. The sages taught. Certain philosophers asked the Jewish sages who were in Rome. So there are lots of stories in the Talmud about Jews, and particularly rabbis, interacting with non-Jews, and non-Jews challenging them. Some of these stories may have really happened because there were interactions, or the non-Jew asking the question is just like the setup for the story. So maybe it happened, it maybe didn't happen, but this is the question. If it is not your God's will that people should engage in idol worship, for what reason does God not eliminate it? Right? If God doesn't want us to act in certain ways, why doesn't God just get rid of the temptation or the problem? Why doesn't God just uproot idolatry out of the world? We sort of asked this question with the Noah story. If people were so evil, then why didn't just God go in and fix the people? Like, there's a lot of effort to destroy a whole world and start again. Why don't you just, create humanity 2.0 and, just come up with a better, improved product? So if idol worship is a problem, why doesn't God just get rid of idol worship? And the rabbis, the sages, said to them, were people worshiping only objects for which the world has no need, God would eliminate it. But they worship the sun and the moon and the stars and the constellations. Should God destroy the world because of fools? So why can't God get rid of idol worship? What are people worshiping?
They're worshiping the world.
Right? They're worshiping, right, the world, the sun, the moon. Like if people were just worshiping this pen, in theory, God could get rid of pens. God wanted to get rid of pens because we could all exist without pens. But they're saying God can't get rid of, isn't going to get rid of the sun and the moon and the ocean because of fools, right? There's actually a sort of, I would say, a companion piece to this about why were human beings created with the inclination for evil. And the story goes, as you may find this theologically satisfying or not, that God comes down and takes away the evil inclination from people. And once God took away the evil inclination from people, no more babies were born. In other words, sexual drive can be, and other inclinations can be used for evil, but without sex drive, there'll be no children. So the very thing which allows us to be fruitful and multiply and fill the world with, the next generations and do what we're supposed to do, can be used for good. It can be used for bad. And I think they also, like, nobody went to work. Like, once God took away the evil inclination, nobody went to work, right? Like, so, we could have a drive for greed and amassing things that we don't need, but that very same drive is what allows us to go out in the world and be productive and create and, make money and support our families. So, we have this piece about why doesn't God just uproot, certain things from human beings? Because human beings really need those things. And so the same is true about something like idol worship. God can't just uproot idol worship, because then the very things that the world is, that's part of the world. And God's like, I should destroy the world because people are acting in a foolish way. So rather, the world follows its course, and the fools who sin will be held to judgment in the future for their transgressions. So this has two pieces to it, right? That people act in stupid ways, and God is not going to uproot the world because people act stupidly. But it also brings into the conversation the idea in Judaism, which is part of Judaism now, that you will be held accountable. Maybe not in this world, but in the world to come, and at a certain point, you are going to be held accountable. Like, guess where they, guess who started this idea that ended up creeping into Judaism, right? That you'll be judged and you'll be held accountable for your actions in this world. And there will be some sort of comeuppance at a certain point, but God is not going to destroy the world to do that. So here, this is really fascinating. And when you read the one about a baby being born, think about some of our more ridiculous anti-abortion Christian counterparts. Let's just say that. Consider the case of one who sold a se'ah, about 9 quarts of wheat, and went and planted it in the ground. So you stole wheat and you went and planted it. If life was fair, what would happen to that wheat? Or if God was acting in the world, what should happen to that wheat? It shouldn't grow, right? Stolen wheat shouldn't grow. By right, it should not grow. But the world goes along and follows its course, and the fools who sinned will be held in judgment in the future for their transgressions, right? The world follows its course. There are laws of nature, and they are set into place, and they don't change whether you are good or whether you are bad, right? And this is sort of, the Rabbi Akiva story is about astrologers predicting the future, and that we don't believe in astrologers. But if a snake bites you and you're a good person, if it's a poisonous snake, you're still going to die for the snake bite. Right? If you're a bad person and you've stolen wheat and you plant it, the wheat is going to grow. The world has natural laws and natural order. Those are the laws that are going to be followed, and God is not going to go in and start tinkering with making sure there's good outcomes for good people and bad outcomes for bad people. So you see this really sort of much more robust development of a theology that says, people will be accountable eventually, but don't think that you're going to see it, in the world on a day-to-day basis. Consider the case of one who engaged in intercourse with the wife of another. By right, she should not become pregnant. But the world goes along and follows its course, and the fools who sinned will be held into judgment in the future for their transgressions. So, right, like an adulteress, a couple that are, an adulterous woman, by all rights, shouldn't get pregnant. When I read this, of course, it reminds me of, I don't remember who said it, I think it was somebody in Congress, but I don't remember that, right? Like if a woman, you want to talk about no exceptions for abortion in cases of rape and incest, because if a woman is raped, God is not going to allow her to get pregnant.
He was from Missouri.
Thank you. So the
It's the one that
Talmud,
Claire McCaskill defeated.
Yeah.
so you know, so the Talmud would be like, that is ridiculous, right? That is absolutely ridiculous, because the world has a natural order and the natural order takes place. So look at this last paragraph. And this is as Reish Lakish says, the Holy One, blessed be he. So he's actually putting words in God's mouth to make a lesson, but it's always interesting to see, like, if God could speak, this is what God would say right now. Is it not enough for the wicked that they treat my dye for a Sela coin as if it were ownerless, using it without my permission and against my will, as they impregnate women adulterously? But moreover, they also trouble me and cause me to sign the result of their actions against my will, as I form the fetus and give it life, even when its creation is the result of prohibited sexual intercourse. So just to back up for a minute, there's another teaching in the Torah that says that one of the greatness of God is when a Roman emperor mints a coin in his honor, every coin looks the same, right? So if we have a coin of Caesar, and Caesar wants his image on the coin, every single coin looks like Caesar. But the greatness of our God is that when we are imprinted, when God wants to imprint God's image on human beings, is if each of us were a coin, each of us look differently. That's God's greatness, right? For every individual created in the image of God, we all are unique, look unique. So so God's coin is minted with uniqueness, not the same. So, but human beings treat these coins, treat these, precious gifts of our body and ourselves in reckless ways, as if we belong to no one, as if we don't have an owner. And without God's permission, we create adultery. We have adultery, and then these men impregnate women. And God says, as if God's upstairs, like minting every baby that's about to be born. So this has got a little bit more actively involved. God's like, I don't even want to do. You think I want to mint this baby in my image who was impregnated through adultery? But I have to, because that's the natural order of the world, right? So God doesn't really, this is interesting theology that, God, human beings force God's hands because God has set the laws of the world in motion, and God is not going to interfere with the laws of nature. And this is much more like the creation story that we looked at, right? I created the world, I set everything in motion, now it's yours. And I'm not going to come in. We do have one story of God making the sun stand still when Joshua is battling. But other than that one story, right, the Talmud is saying there are laws of nature, and human beings are subject to the laws of nature, and God is even subject to the laws of nature. God is not going to come in. So if you ask the question, like, why did all of these people die in an earthquake? Like, God is not going to come in and save people from an earthquake. You might want to, not live on a fault line. But God is not going to come in and stop an earthquake and stop a fire and stop a flood and stop that. We are all subject to those laws. So before we go on to one more source, thoughts, questions?
I have a question on fate, going back to fate.
Yeah.
When you think about what was near and dear to us recently with the people in Highland Park,
Yeah.
and how, they're all standing in a group on the curb. And how is it that fate was bad for every other person or so? I mean, and the world goes on. It's
You say
and also how did Rabbi Kushner explain or grapple with in a philosophical, rabbinical session like you're referring to about the condition of his daughter?
of his son. He would say God does not act in the world, right? God doesn't act in the world. God doesn't cause disease. God doesn't send down disease, and God doesn't save from disease. And so I don't know, for everybody, it's the most comforting theology, because when you're praying to God to heal your sick child or family member or loved one, look, this is the crux of all theology. And this is where it gets this is where the rubber hits the road, right? When you pray to God for a miracle or for healing or for God to heal your loved one, sometimes people recover and sometimes people don't. And so then the question becomes, did my loved one recover because I prayed? Did my loved one not recover because I didn't pray? Does sometimes prayer work and sometimes prayer doesn't work? And what Harold Kushner's theology is, and I frankly probably fits my theology the most closely, is that there are certain things you can pray to God for and expect to be answered, and certain things you can't. You can pray to God for strength. You can pray to God for compassion. You can pray to God for patience. And those things, if you work on them, could be granted, but the body takes its course. And God doesn't step in and create a miracle. And now the problem with that is then the logical place that could lead certain people is then what do I need God for? If God's not going to come in and help me when I really need help, then why do I even need God? So that's where, but Judaism it does not have simple answers to any of these questions. Unless maybe if you're ultra Orthodox, in which case you already accept a more fundamentalist view of God and view of the world to begin with. Many years ago, after a terrible terrorist attack in Israel, I think I shared this a couple weeks ago, where children were killed. And one of the ultra-Orthodox rabbis said, in Israel, maybe the parents hadn't checked the mezuzahs. Like the idea that if you didn't have a kosher mezuzah, who would want a theology like that? Why would that be comforting to anybody? The thought that if you do something wrong like that, inadvertently through laziness or sloppiness, that such a terrible outcome could happen. So, I feel a lot more comfortable with a theology that human beings are frail and things happen to our bodies. And sometimes I think when I pray for people that are ill, it's not that I think that a miracle is going to happen, it's that I need to feel more of a closeness and more of a support and more of a sense of not being alone at the time when, I'm going through something really, really scary. But that we're not supposed to expect miracles. And so this Talmudic, and so that's what Harold Kushner would say. And his whole theology is that bad things happen to good people and good things happen to bad people. And that's kind of the way the world works. And frankly, I, would prefer it to be otherwise, but there's no other satisfactory answer to why, there's so much suffering in the world. But yes, I mean, Highland Park, all of these are the idea that I was just standing at the wrong place in the wrong time. If I was on the outside of the parade, I was safer. If I was close to where the shooter was accidentally, because you could be standing anywhere, then you were in the line of fire. But I will say, when it comes to gun violence, my whole life, probably until the Trump election, I really did believe that if there was a really problem in society, that good-minded people would band together, Mothers Against Drunk Drivers, right? Something terrible would happen, but people would band together and they would form these organizations and they would start to change laws and to try to make some of these problems better. And I think the horrible thing about guns and assault weapons is no matter what the will of the people is, that we're being held hostage by people in this country that will never allow these laws to be changed, or at least maybe not anywhere in the foreseeable future. You know, so Illinois will ban assault weapons and somebody will take it to the Supreme Court and chances are it'll be overturned. So, you know, it's whatever. Okay, let's look at one more. Sorry about that little rant. Okay. Had to remind myself what we were looking at for a minute. Okay, so unless you think that we are the first generation to struggle with, okay, there's this evil in the world, there's random violence in the world, there's, you know, terrible things that happen, and I'm angry at God, and I can't say the things about God. You know, I can't say God is good, and I can't say God is all knowing, and I don't even know if I can say that there's God, right? Like whatever it is that you may be thinking, this is a source that's 2,000 years old. So Rabbi Joshua said of Levi, why were they called the men of the great assembly? So let's just back up, right? The Sanhedrin, which was the ruling body of the Jewish community at the time of the Romans, was referred to either as the Sanhedrin, but sometimes they were also referred to as men of the great assembly. So really all that meant, it was like calling them Congress, right? It was calling them, you know, the executive council, whatever it is that you were calling them. So Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, they were the big assembly. But Gadol could be big, but Gadol could also be great, because great can mean something that's a lot or big, but great can also be a quality, right? So these were men that were not just a large number, but had a greatness to them. So the question is, what did they do that was so great? Why were they called great? Because they restored the crown to its greatness, i.e., they brought about a renewal of God's greatness. So why are they considered great? You could have probably thought a lot of reasons, because they make laws, because they rule justly, because they take on a lot of responsibility. This is just a made up story, right? This is just a made up story. But what made these people, what made this group so great? They restored God's glory. So how did they restore, like, how did they do that? I feel like there's just a tad of background, right? The rabbis were living at a time where Rome had taken over. They had no autonomy. The temple was destroyed. The Jewish community much like fled, were exiled, or were led to Rome in, you know, chains. They could see no future for having the temple or their own government restored. There was a lot of suffering, like any suffering, illness and disease and high taxes and Roman soldiers on the road, and things were really, really bad. And the logical question when things are bad, especially for them, would be the question that probably anybody would ask is, where is God? And so this story wants to imagine that the leadership was not great in just that it took care of the people or took care of their governmental needs. They were great because they allowed, well, it's sort of what I was saying already. They restored God's honor and allowed and found a way to continue to be in relationship with God, even with all of these swirling questions of evil in the world. So Moses, this is a quote from Deuteronomy, Moses says that God is great, powerful, and awesome, right? So this is, what are the attributes of God? God is great, God is powerful, God is awesome. Jeremiah, who was the prophet when the first temple was destroyed and Jeremiah was led away in chains with much of the population to Babylonia, exiled after the destruction of the first temple by the Babylonians. Jeremiah, who prophesied that that was going to happen, said, strangers are frolicking in God's sanctuary, right? The Babylonians destroyed God's sanctuary and people are like running around where God's not awesome. Where's God's awesomeness? And therefore, when he prayed, he only said God was great and powerful. So he edited one of the attributes that Moses attributed to God. He takes one of them out because he no longer believes that God is awesome. So he stopped saying awesome. Daniel, remember Daniel in the lion den story? He's in exile in Babylonia. Daniel, who lived during the Babylonian captivity that followed the first temple's destruction, followed and said, strangers are enslaving God's children. Where are the displays of God's power? And so he did not say powerful, right? Daniel's like, we're all exiled and living in slavery under Babylonia. Clearly, if God's people are living as exiles, God isn't powerful. I can't say those words, right? So I can't say those words. So I'm not going to say that. I won't say that God is awesome. I won't say God is powerful. I will only use the word great. The men of the great assembly followed and said, on the contrary, this is God's magnificent strength. For God restrains God's will, showing forbearance to the wicked. So God, what makes God really great and strong is God is controlling God's self. Like God would like to come down and mess up, the natural order of the world by destroying the wicked, but God shows restraint from doing this. Therefore, God is great. And these are the displays of God's awesomeness, because were it not for the awe of the blessed Holy One, how could one solitary singular nation survive amongst the nations of the world, right? If God wasn't awesome, we wouldn't even be here, which actually works for me as a prayer, frankly, like the Jewish people even being here at all. So the fact that this one little teeny nation survives, that shows that God is awesome. And how could the masters, the prophets, do this? Were they not uprooting a decree that Moses had made? Rabbi Elazar said they knew that God is truthful and therefore they would not lie about God. So the men of the great assembly, in theory, as if this ever really happened, restored Moses's original prayer. So then the question at the end is like, well, why didn't they, even if they didn't believe God was awesome and great, why didn't they just say it anyways? Because it was Moses's prayer. And the answer is because they're being truthful and they're not going to say prayers that they don't believe to be true. So from a modern perspective, this is fascinating, right? Because I know, how many people I know that say to me, I read the prayers and they don't mean to me and I don't believe this about God and I can't say them and I can't say the words if I don't believe them. And I'm like, well, you know what? You're in really good company. Because some of our rabbis said that too. Our prophets said that 2,000 years ago, that they're not going to say words that they don't believe. But what did the men of the great assembly do? Instead of saying, we're not going to say words that we don't believe, we're going to reinterpret them. We're going to reinterpret them. Maybe Moses thought God was awesome because he led the children out of slavery. And Daniel thinks that God isn't awesome because he doesn't lead his peers out of slavery. So we're going to say what's awesome about God is God doesn't, interfere with the world. And God, holds God's temper and leaves the world for us to deal with. As I said, sometimes I think we could use a little bit more help, but okay. Right. So instead of saying we're going to get rid of the words, we're just going to reinterpret them so we can still say them. And this is 2,000 years old. And I find this teaching so powerful and so beautiful in the idea that, what does it mean to try to keep the words of prayer that maybe we don't, believe everything that it says? But is there a way to sort of reinterpret it so that we can continue to say the words of Moses or the words of our ancestors? And if we can't, and if we don't, and if we edit out some words for the sake of truthfulness, well, guess what? That's part of the tradition too. So I think, so this is sort of, it doesn't Well, the answer for this one is, why doesn't God act in the world? It's like, well, God would want to, but it's not the world. God wants the world to run on the laws of nature, and not coming in and messing around every time something goes wrong, it's constantly. So God would never be not acting in the world, because it's never ending. So I don't know. So what do you make of this? Yeah, Eileen?
So the comment about not being able to say the words of the prayers because the words are not personally meaningful for someone. I'm somewhat visual, and when I close my eyes, what I see is like this enormous chain through history that connects the Jews that were, the Jews that are, and the Jews that will be, and that the words of the prayer, it's part of the material of the chain.
Right. No, I feel that way too, because I certainly don't believe every word that I'm praying in the Siddur, but the fact that Jews have been saying it for thousands of years is very meaningful. So Didi had a really interesting conversation. I got to meet Ren, as you may or may not know, for coffee on Sunday. So she had sent me this Siddur that the Hebrew has been totally made gender neutral, which I thought was unbelievable and very cool, and an unbelievable, like, the amount of work, because every single prayer, including the Psalms, it was unbelievable. But I told her what I didn't like about the Siddur, and she agreed with me. This is what is that, I mean, Ren agreed with me, but when I read the introduction, because I want to know, like, how did she decide how to do this? Is this what they're doing in Israel? Which it's not standardized. She wrote about editing out any of the prayers that had any mention of longing for Zion and return to Zion, and instead replace them with prayers for, because she's of this woman, I think it's a woman, I'm not really sure, is of her generation, restored this with prayers for a decolonized world. Now, I don't have a problem with, if you want to pray for a decolonized world, you could add, just like we had a prayer for peace, add a prayer for a decolonized world. Like, if that's the world you want to see, by all means, add a prayer. But to edit out anywhere where our ancestors longed for Zion, regardless of how you feel about the state of Israel. I mean, you could be an anti-Zionist. You could think that there shouldn't be a democratic Jewish state of Israel in existence today. I don't happen to agree with that, but if that's what you believe, that's what you believe. But the idea that you would edit out our ancestors' reality of their longing for Zion, given the times that they were living in, I can't. So I said that I can't. The Siddur becomes unusable to me, and it felt like a betrayal. So, I think about that a lot. Like, we have some edits in our prayer book. Like, the conservative movement has made some edits in our prayer book. Like, God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, right? Doesn't say that in the original. Got rid of the blessing, thank you, God, for not making me a woman. Like, there are certain things the conservative movement said, this has to go. But 95% of it, they kept the same. And part of it is the sense of, like, we may not, so the question is, when does it go so far that you have to get rid of it? And when do you say, I make my peace with it, even though I don't agree with everything it says, because it represents, this inherited tradition of 2,000 years ago. I mean, the Siddur, as we have it, more or less is 1,000 years old, and the core of it is much older than that. So, but the idea that I love about this piece of Talmud that's 2,000 years old is they're struggling, right? They're also struggling with, what does it mean to say these things about God that we don't see in our world? We don't see it. And we're living through horrible, horrible, horrible times of human suffering and political suffering. Not just, it's always human suffering, but political suffering of the people, of the anti-Semitism, of the, but we're going to, so they restore God, right? They restore God's greatness. That's why the Knesset HaGadolah is considered great, because they insist that God is still all of these things, just slightly different than maybe we had understood it. So I just find it a fascinating text. Yes, I know.
Well, in regards to what you just said, it's sort of like I've been thinking about this whole session. And you referred to the elder rabbis of the ancient times. They reinterpreted. But I'm wondering, do rabbis have conferences of today, of the modern time, when they don't reinterpret, but do they, maybe there's a thin line between the two words I'm going to use, not reinterpret, but reevaluate?
From a
Because of the-
theological point of view, or from a like just liturgical point of view?
well, I guess I'm looking for a logical and a liturgical that would be more acceptable to the times that you're referring to
Yeah.
with the, I mean, evil in our government, whether, human sacrifice, human suffering is, as you say, seems to be a given.
Right.
But
Yeah,
here in the
yeah.
evil of government, is there some kind of answers that we can, because we can't just accept and move on.
Right.
There's gotta be some kind of, I don't know, I just struggle with that so
Yeah,
much.
I don't know that anybody's currently, like, we don't have conferences where we talk about theology or talk about our belief system. We do a lot of that in rabbinical school. I don't know if there's any, like, David Hartman wrote a lot about making sense of these things. He's been gone for many years. Obviously, Harold Kushner, Neil Gilman, we have a group of women in the synagogue reading his book, Sacred Fragments, right now. There are people that have done it, but whether there are people that are currently doing it, nobody that I can think of. The
Are
thing,
there people out there that are asking, like I'm asking?
everybody's asking. Did I tell you the story? I think I told you the story last week, that one of the young people in the congregation after
Yeah.
service said to me, if God is perfect and we're created in God's image, why aren't we perfect? And it's like,
Yeah,
everybody's asking, right? Everybody's asking. Everybody, this is, the human condition of trying to figure this all out. And, I know everybody's like, this is going to pass, it's going to pass. But, part of what I'm struggling with, and I think a lot of us are struggling with, is, we're seeing a world or at least a country that seemed to be getting better and more fair and more inclusive. And to watch like the backwards movement of the last 6 years, and the undoing of some of the progress that we took for granted, well, we shouldn't have taken for granted, but that we did take for granted. And the sense of, have we hit bottom? Is it going to get worse? And I think that's, for me, a surprising place to be at my stage of life. Like one of my colleagues wrote after Pittsburgh, and I certainly maybe wrote it after Colleyville, which was, nothing really prepared me to talk about anti-Semitism. I never thought I was going to really have to. Like, I never thought that was going to be part of my rabbinate. And that really rang true for me when he said that, because that was the last thing I wanted to talk about. There were so many wonderful, great, wonderful things to say about Judaism, such joyous things, such meaningful things. I will say, though, I think the biggest sort of liturgical change, and we're part of it, is the different use of music and musical instruments and tunes and new music for the liturgy. Less of focus on the words and what the words mean, and more of a focus on the feeling that you can evoke through the different use of music in a service. And I see this really taking on and trying to give people a different kind of spiritual experience through the liturgy that's not just about praying the words. I think that's very much part of the time that we're living in, which I think is a good thing.
it's a very healing thing.
Yeah, I mean, the
When you
idea
go-
that like you can have an experience, I will tell you one of the things Rabbi Kushner said, and and I hear this too occasionally, people really hate Unetana Tokef, right? Who will live and who will die. Like they hate that. Yeah, well, understandably, especially if you're sick, the last thing you want, or somebody you love is sick, like, you know, good luck. And he said, so what his answer is, that's why we pray that in Hebrew, right? Like, don't think about the words so much. Don't take them so literally. Like they're, you know, don't that road leads to despair. So the idea that you can take some of these words and just set these beautiful, beautiful tunes to them and sing them and focus, like take yourself almost out of the words, into a different place through the music. You know, that's where I like to focus our liturgical attention. One of the candidates that we interviewed, and she was lovely, lovely. But the very first interview, she said to us, we asked her about her musical style, and she said, this is where I'm worried that we may not be a good fit, because I don't play guitar, and I don't really like singing in services. I like to do the traditional, it's called nusach, right? The traditional liturgical music. And we were like, thank you so much for telling us that. And then we didn't give her a second interview, because I know somebody else who's from a more traditional congregation who's looking for a cantor, and I like spread the word, like, you should talk to her. Like, she could be wonderful for that kind of a congregation, but we're not going back to that. We're not going backwards. So, you know, I wish her all the best, but she's not the right person for us. So, all right, everyone, have a lovely, lovely day. Stay warm. I'm going to go sit in the window and let the sun shine on me, though.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.